So we're going to start step 6. And in this step 6, we're introducing a new Angular building block, which is directives. Directives are therefore an Angular building block, a bit like components are as well, but with a rather different characteristic and moreover an approach that's a little difficult to grasp at first, but gradually you get used to it. The particularity of directives is that they allow you to modify the tag on which they are applied, compose the component as a visual representation through its HTML and also logical processing through its TypeScript. A directive is, well, it's actually quite different. A directive is applied directly to an Angular component or to a tag in order to modify either its attributes or its structure. So we already distinguish between two types of directives. There are what we call structural directives, which modify the very structure of the tag they are applied to, whether it's a standard HTML tag like a div, or even an Angular component, which, as we've seen, is also accessible via a tag like AppRoot or BalanceCard, those kinds of tags. The purpose of directives is either to modify the structure, to add a bit of something in those are the more complex and rarer types of directives that we might encounter. In our case, we're going to create what's called an attribute directive, where we'll be modifying the attributes of that tag. In this particular example, for step number 6, we are simply going to proceed to change the visual color of the specific tag on which it is currently implemented by carefully modifying the actual text color if the corresponding amount happens to be a negative value. So to create this directive to detect negative amounts, we'll use the Angular CLI, which we've already used, ngg for generate, d for directive, folder and any subfolder, then the name of our directive. This will create something like this for us at first. So it's very empty, but we're going to enhance it a little bit. And it's true that here we're going to incorporate a lot of concepts that we haven't seen yet. That's also what makes Angular a bit difficult. It's true. It's that all the concepts are so intertwined with each other that you first have to get a sense of each one, except that for some concepts, there are others you don't have yet until you reach those concepts. And finally, everything gradually becomes much clearer. And eventually, we realize that we can understand everything we've learned from the beginning. So if I go back a bit to what we're going to be able to do with this directive, I'll separate the blocks a little to explain each one individually. We're going to have this line here, which we already know. So it's an input, meaning a value that will be sent by its parent component. The parent component in a directive is the tag on which this directive is placed. Whether it's an HTML tag, a div, a paragraph, anything, or an Angular component. In our case, it could be an app balance card, it could be anything. So as a result, this variable will receive information from its parent. First, appearance of inject. Inject allows us to inject specific Angular services. Angular has a whole bunch of them. Later on, we'll also see that we can create our own services to add functionality. In particular, since directives are placed on text tags, meaning they're HTML elements on which the directive is applied, we can retrieve this element by using inject_element_ref, which gives us the reference to the element where this directive is placed. And so we'll have this variable, here we call it element, but you can name it whatever you like, which will allow us to access the values of that element. What we want to do is modify the style, and more specifically, the text color of the element on which the directive is placed. So that's what we'll use for this. And then there's the renderer, a service that allows us to modify, as you can see just below, the CSS style of the element to which we've attached it. Next, regarding how it works, we either have the old method, which involved hooking into ng on changes, which is a part of Angular's lifecycle. We'll see a bit later on the entire Angular lifecycle. That's how it was done back then. So we say override, meaning we could modify by adding behavior to functions present in the classes generated by TypeScript, by Angular. And underneath, the algorithmic aspect is actually quite simple. I check that I have some data, and if my data is less than 0, then I go and modify the native element. It's true that on element ref, there's a subobject called native element, and so I'm going to change its color to red, And here, you can put anything you want. It's like you're addressing it in CSS. So we're changing its color to red, but you could use an X code. You can put anything you want. And if this equality, if this if statement isn't satisfied, then we go into the else block and we're going to remove whatever we set for the color. So in that case, we'll remove the red information. That's one example like that. Now, it's true that with signals, but we'll see that a bit later, you can do it differently. So in particular, we have the possibility of using what we call effects. I'll come back to that in much more detail when we get to the part that's specifically about effects and specifically about Angular signal in Angular. But it would be just as simple as putting this here. In the end, the two ways of writing it that I showed here are identical. To say a quick word about effects, they allow us to react to changes in variables that are signal only. Since here our input is a signal type input, any and all changes made will be automatically detected by the effect, and this particular callback function here will be executed for each and every one of the signals that are modified or altered inside. So I can leave you with this way of doing things. At least in the very latest Angular 17, this is indeed the most effective and straightforward way to make significant changes and then immediately observe what changes are reflected on the application side, providing a clear and instantaneous feedback loop. Let me just get back to this particular point. Here, it is the parent component that actually sends, for example, now a negative value, which then effectively changes this specific variable. And let us also take a very careful look at what has been significantly modified. We can go to step 6 to try to understand a bit more. On the TypeScript side, it's going to be pretty light. What's interesting is to see how it's used. Here we've connected it just like we connected inputs. But here it's our directive on a div, but we can attach it to any tag, even an Angular component, by specifying a value. Here I'm simply passing up the amount from our balance object that we created in our interface. So the amount that's displayed here, I'm passing it up to my directive. My directive here will then execute, in this case, the effect. Since the variable can be modified, it will re-execute the effect, and at that point, it will run its if statement and determine whether to add the red color to the element or remove it. Which brings us to step 6. We've just created an attribute directive that allows us to modify an attribute of the tag it's placed on. That's really going to be the purpose of the directive we create. There are others, as I mentioned, structural directives, but those are a bit more specific. That's notably what ngIf used to be back in the day. Nicks were directives, what we call structural directives, because they modified the very structure of the tag they were placed on. They would either remove it or display it. To come back to this, we react to data without touching the parent component, without touching the raw HTML. The directive modifies the attributes of the tag it is placed on. That brings us to step 6, and we can move on to step 7.